Sometimes the very thing that makes you different is exactly what the world has been waiting for. The cobblestones of Ravencrest's grand cathedral were slick with autumn rain as hundreds of cloaked figures gathered for the blood trial, that ancient ritual where young vampires prove their heritage or face eternal exile. Elara Whitmore stood in the center of the ceremonial circle, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the mortal blood coursing through her veins, threatening to betray her secret with every thundering heartbeat. For 23 years, she'd hidden among them, brewing healing potions in her father's apothecary, learning to move like shadow, to speak like silk. But tonight, under the piercing gaze of the Blood Council, her carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The silver chalice was passed to her lips. One sip would reveal her true nature to everyone present. As the metallic liquid touched her tongue, gasps echoed through the cathedral. Her blood ran red, not black, human, tainted. The crowd's whispers turned to snarls, their elegant masks slipping to reveal fanged contempt. But just as the council raised their hands to pronounce her fate, a figure emerged from the shadows. Tall, ancient, impossibly beautiful. Time stopped. Literally. What power could freeze an entire cathedral of immortals? And why had the legendary Vampire King chosen this moment to reveal himself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence was absolute, not the hushed reverence of prayer, but the terrible stillness of a world suddenly robbed of breath. Every raindrop hung suspended in the cathedral's arched windows like crystal tears. The council members stood frozen mid-gesture, their pale hands caught reaching toward her in condemnation. Even the candle flames had ceased their dance, becoming pillars of motionless gold against the Gothic stone. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs as she turned toward the figure who had emerged from the shadows. Lucien Dracul. She knew him from the oil paintings that lined the cathedral's walls, though those portraits captured none of his terrible beauty. His dark hair fell in waves past his shoulders, and his skin held the luminous pallor that only came with centuries of avoiding sunlight. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch, silver like moonlight on water, ancient beyond measure, and fixed entirely on her. "Interesting," he murmured, his voice carrying perfectly through the supernatural stillness. He moved with fluid grace between the frozen figures, his long black coat sweeping behind him like wings, a half-blood who's managed to fool them all for 23 years. "Tell me, little apothecary, how did you manage to suppress your heartbeat during the monthly assemblies?" Elara's mouth went dry. Of course he knew about the assemblies, those midnight gatherings where vampires conducted business while she stood in the shadows grinding herbs and pretending her pulse didn't race whenever someone looked too closely. "Foxglove extract," she whispered. "Small doses. Slows the heart rate without stopping it entirely." A smile ghosted across his lips, revealing just a hint of fangs. "Clever." "And the scent masking?" "Nightshade oil." Applied to pulse points. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. After years of guarding her secrets, it felt surreal to be discussing them so casually while surrounded by hundreds of frozen vampires who wanted her dead. Even cleverer. He circled her slowly, studying her with the intensity of a predator. "Though I suspect your father helped with those particular recipes." The mention of her father sent ice through her veins. Marcus Whitmore had raised her alone after her mother's death in childbirth, never speaking of what had driven him to love a human woman, never explaining why he'd chosen to protect their forbidden child rather than expose her to the council as law demanded. "Please," she breathed, "don't hurt him. He only protected what he loved." Lucien stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his dark irises. An admirable quality, though ultimately futile. "Did you really think you could hide forever?" Shame burned in her chest. She'd tried so hard to belong, spending her childhood learning vampire customs, perfecting their elegant mannerisms, studying their ancient histories until she could recite bloodline genealogies better than most pure bloods. But belonging was more than knowledge. It was heritage, and hers was written in red blood and mortal breath. Why? The question escaped before she could bite it back. Why stop time? Why reveal yourself after 3 centuries of hiding? His expression shifted, becoming unreadable. Because tonight changes everything. He reached out and touched her chin, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. His fingers were cold as marble. The blood trial isn't just about proving heritage, little half-blood. It's about identifying the one whose blood carries both mortal life and immortal power. I don't understand. Your blood ran red when it touched the silver, yes? But tell me, did you taste copper on your tongue, or something sweeter? Ilara's brow furrowed as she recalled that moment of terror. The chalice had been bitter against her lips, the liquid inside metallic and sharp, but underneath... Honey, she whispered. It tasted like honey. Because it recognized you. His thumb traced along her jawline. The chalice contains tears from the first vampire, shed when our kind was born from shadow and starlight. It reacts to purity of blood, but not the purity the council believes they're testing for. Around them, the frozen vampires maintained their expressions of disgust and rage. Lady Pembroke's mouth was caught open mid-snarl. Lord Ashford's hand gripped his walking stick so tightly his knuckles had gone white. These were the creatures she'd spent her life trying to please, people who would have torn her apart without a second thought. What happens now? She asked, though she feared the answer. Lucian's smile returned, sharp and dangerous. Now, Miss Whitmore, you discover why a half-blood apothecary's daughter is worth stopping time for. He stepped back, and she noticed for the first time the elaborate silver pendant at his throat, a raven with wings spread wide, eyes made of tiny black diamonds. The real question is whether you're brave enough to learn the truth about what you really are. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first crack appeared in his temporal spell. Time was reasserting itself, and when it did, the council would complete their condemnation. Unless she chose to trust the most dangerous vampire in existence. Her fate hung in the balance, and eternity waited for her answer. The crack in time widened like a fault line through reality itself, and Ilara felt the pull of what she was about to lose. Not just her life. She'd already accepted that death might claim her tonight, but everything that had ever mattered. The small, careful world she'd built from shadows and secrets, from stolen moments of belonging and the fierce love of a father who'd risked everything to keep her alive. Choose quickly, Lucian murmured, his silver eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. In 30 seconds, they'll remember how to breathe. In 60, they'll remember how to kill. Ilara's gaze swept across the frozen cathedral, taking in faces she'd known since childhood. Lord Ashford, who'd praised her knowledge of bloodline histories during the winter assemblies. Lady Pembroke, who'd once complimented the clarity of her pain tonics. Master Aldrich, who'd taught her the proper way to bow before the council's seal. All of them caught now in expressions of pure revulsion, their elegant masks finally stripped away to reveal what they'd always thought of her, an abomination, a stain upon their perfect society. But beneath the horror of that revelation lay something else, the sudden, devastating clarity of all the moments that had led her here. Every careful breath she'd taken in their presence, every pulse point anointed with nightshade oil, every lie told with a steady voice while her mortal heart screamed the truth. She thought of her father's apothecary shop, nestled between the cobblestone streets of Lower Ravencrest where fog rolled up from the river like reaching fingers. The familiar weight of the brass pestle in her palm as she ground herbs by candlelight. The scratch of her pen across order forms written in her careful script. The gentle chime of the bell above the door when customers arrived seeking remedies for ailments, both mortal and immortal. For 7 years, she'd managed the shop's night business while her father handled the day trade, serving a clientele that included lesser vampires, ghouls, and the occasional witch seeking rare components. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was hers. She knew the exact temperature needed to activate belladonna extract, could identify hemlock by touch alone, and had perfected a sleeping draught so effective that even ancient vampires praised its potency. In those quiet hours between midnight and dawn, grinding powders and brewing tinctures, she'd found something resembling peace. Her father would be waiting for her now, pacing the length of their small apartment above the shop. Marcus Whitmore, a vampire old enough to remember when Ravencrest was just a collection of fishing villages, but who'd chosen love over law and spent the last 23 years living with the consequences. He'd tried to hide his fear tonight as she'd prepared for the trial, but she'd seen it in the careful way he de-avoided her eyes, the tremor in his hands as he'd helped fasten the silver buttons on her ceremonial dress. "Promise me," he'd whispered as she'd reached for the door. "Whatever happens, promise you'll remember that you're exactly who you're meant to be." Now she understood what he'd really been trying to say. Not that she belonged with the vampires who tormented her with their conditional acceptance, but that belonging itself might be a choice rather than a birthright. Thunder rolled overhead again, closer now, and another crack appeared in Lucien's spell. Through the cathedral's stained-glass windows, she could see the gas lamps of Upper Ravencrest flickering like earthbound stars, could imagine the familiar rhythm of her ordinary life continuing without her. Mrs. Blackwood would come to the shop tomorrow, seeking her monthly bottle of arthritis remedy, and find the door locked. The young vampire who suffered from chronic blood sickness would discover his standing order unfilled. Her father would have to explain again and again that his daughter was gone, unless she chose differently. "The truth about what I really am," she said slowly, tasting the words like an unfamiliar potion. "Will it hurt him?" "My father?" Lucien's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Marcus knew this day would come long before you did. He's been preparing for it in ways you cannot imagine." A chill that had nothing to do with the cathedral's stone walls settled over her. "You've spoken to him?" "Your father and I have an understanding." Lucien moved closer as time continued its inexorable return, the frozen raindrops beginning to tremble against the windows. "About you, about what your blood represents. About the choice you'd face if you survived the trial." The weight of years pressed down on her. Every careful deception, every moment of longing for acceptance, every night spent grinding herbs while dreaming of a world where her heartbeat didn't mark her as an outsider. It was a small life by vampire standards, perhaps, but it had been hers. Safe, predictable, real. Now Lucien Dracul offered her something else entirely. Truth, whatever that might cost. Around them, the spell began to fracture in earnest. Time reasserted itself like a held breath finally released, and Ilara Whitmore made her choice. "I choose truth," Ilara whispered, and the words seemed to echo through the cathedral with unnatural resonance. The moment she spoke, the world exploded back into motion. Gasps and shouts erupted from the council as time snapped into place like a broken bone setting itself. Rain resumed its assault against the windows. Candle flames resumed their dance, and the frozen expressions of hatred became living fury once more. But something had changed. Where before there had been only condemnation in their faces, now there was fear. Raw, primitive terror that seemed to emanate from Lucien's very presence. Lord Ashford stumbled backward so violently he nearly toppled over a pew. Lady Pembroke's face had gone ashen, her carefully applied rouge standing out like blood on marble. "Impossible," Master Aldrich breathed, his voice cracking on the word. "You're supposed to be dead?" Lucien's voice cut through the chaos with razor precision. He hadn't raised his tone, but somehow every word carried to the farthest corners of the cathedral. "Yes, I imagine that would be convenient for you. Tell me, Aldrich, how many half-bloods has the Council eliminated over the past 3 centuries? How many potential bloodline carriers did you destroy in your ignorance?" The ancient vampire's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish dragged from water. Around him, other council members began backing toward the exits, their supernatural grace abandoned in favor of simple animal retreat. Ilara felt the shift in the air, not just fear, but something deeper. Recognition. These creatures who had lauded their superiority over her for years now cowered before the vampire she stood beside, and she began to understand that her choice had consequences far beyond her own fate. The bloodline wars, she whispered, fragments of half-remembered history lessons suddenly clicking into place. You ended them by disappearing. The treaties, the territorial agreements, they were all built on the assumption that you'd never return. Lucian's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Clever girl. Yes, my absence has been quite convenient for certain ambitions. The council has grown comfortable in their role as interim rulers, haven't they? Lady Pembroke found her voice, though it trembled with barely controlled panic. The girl is an abomination. Half-blood filth that should have been exposed and destroyed years ago. Whatever game you're playing, Lucian, she's not worth. The temperature in the cathedral plummeted. Frost began forming on the pews, and Alara's breath misted in the suddenly arctic air. When Lucian turned toward Lady Pembroke, his silver eyes had gone completely white, like twin moons in his pale face. Choose your next words very carefully, Victoria, he said, and his voice carried the weight of avalanches. This abomination is worth more than your entire bloodline combined. The threat in those words was unmistakable, but what struck Alara wasn't the power behind them, it was the protection. He was defending her, not claiming her as property or a useful tool, but actually defending her honor against creatures who had spent her lifetime making her feel worthless. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it, spoken loud enough for the entire assembly to hear. Why does my blood matter? What aren't you telling me? Lucian turned back to her, and for just a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his ancient features. Because you're not just half human, Alara. You're half something else entirely. Something that was supposed to be myth. The cathedral fell into absolute silence. Even the rain seemed to quiet, as if the very elements were holding their breath. The original bloodline, Master Aldrich whispered, his face going grey. The source vampires. But that's impossible. They all died out during the Dark Century. There are no living descendants. Are you so certain? Lucian's voice carried amusement now, but it was the kind of humor that preceded executions. Tell me, what did you think happened to the source vampire children who survived? Did you imagine they simply vanished into legend? Alara's knees nearly gave out as understanding crashed over her. Her mother, her mysterious, never-discussed human mother, who had supposedly died in childbirth. The woman her father spoke of only in whispers, always with an expression of pain so profound it seemed to age him centuries in seconds. She wasn't human, she breathed. No, Lucian confirmed gently. Elena Nightborn was the last known descendant of the Source bloodline. When she fell in love with your father, it wasn't just forbidden, it was revolutionary. Their union created something that hasn't existed for 1,000 years, a bridge between the mortal world and the original vampire magic. The implications hit her like physical blows. Every potion she'd brewed with unusual success. Every healing tonic that worked better than it should have. Every moment when she'd felt different, special, powerful in ways she couldn't name. Thunder cracked overhead, and through the stained glass windows, she saw something that made her heart stop. Shapes moving through the fog-shrouded streets of Ravencrest. Dozens of them, hundreds, an army converging on the cathedral. They've found us, Lucian murmured, following her gaze. Your choice has consequences, little one. Are you prepared to face them? The shapes in the fog moved with predatory grace, and Alara's newfound courage crumbled like ancient parchment. Through the stained glass windows she could make out the glint of silver weapons, the flutter of dark cloaks, the organized formation of what could only be vampire hunters, or worse, rival factions who'd learned of Lucian's return. I can't, she whispered, backing away from the window. The weight of revelation pressed down on her like a tombstone. Source bloodline, original vampire magic, a bridge between worlds. The words felt too large for her mind to contain, too dangerous for someone who'd spent her life measuring herbs and mixing simple remedies. I'm just an apothecary's daughter. I grind roots and brew tonics. I don't know anything about ancient bloodlines or vampire politics or saving a dying realm. Lucian's voice cut through her rising panic with surgical precision. Because that's what hangs in the balance, Miss Whitmore. Not just your life, or mine, but the survival of vampire society itself. The cathedral doors shuddered under a tremendous impact, and dust rained down from the Gothic arches above. Whatever force approached wasn't bothering with subtlety anymore. Ilara's mortal heart hammered against her ribs as the reality of her situation crystallized with terrifying clarity. She thought of her father's shop, of the quiet life she'd built from careful lies and measured breaths. Mrs. Blackwood would never receive her arthritis remedy. The young vampire with blood sickness would suffer without his monthly treatment. Her father would face questioning, persecution, possibly death for harboring her secret all these years. The small circle of safety they'd created would be shattered, and everyone she'd ever cared about would pay the price for her moment of truth. "My father," she said, her voice breaking. "If I'm truly what you say I am, they'll tear him apart for hiding me. 23 years of protecting a source descendant, the council will call it treason." "They'll call it many things," Lucian agreed, his silver eyes tracking the approaching army through the windows. But Marcus knew the risks when he chose love over law, just as your mother did when she revealed her true nature to him. Another impact shook the doors, followed by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. The council members had abandoned all pretense of dignity, some attempting to flee through side exits, while others huddled behind pews like children hiding from lightning. Their terror was palpable, filling the air with a metallic scent of fear. Ilara pressed her palms against her temples, trying to quiet the chaos in her mind. "I don't understand any of this. If my mother was source bloodline, why didn't she fight? Why didn't she claim her power and protect herself?" "Because power without wisdom is destruction," Lucian said gently. "Elena chose to hide, to live quietly, to raise you in safety rather than claim a throne that would have made you both targets from birth. But hiding is no longer an option." The stained glass window depicting St. Corvius exploded inward in a shower of jeweled fragments. Dark shapes poured through the opening, moving with inhuman speed, and Ilara caught the gleam of silver blades, the flash of fangs, the cold glitter of eyes that held no mercy. The Crimson Order, Master Aldrich, gasped from behind an overturned pew. "They've found us!" Ilara's blood turned to ice. Even she, sheltered as she'd been, knew that name. The Crimson Order, vampire purists who believed that any dilution of bloodlines was an abomination to be cleansed from the world. They'd been hunting source descendants for centuries, believing that the original bloodline's power was too dangerous to be allowed to resurface. And now they'd come for her. "Run," she whispered, grabbing Lucian's coat sleeve. "Please, just let them have me. You've been hidden for 3 centuries. Don't throw that away for someone who doesn't even know how to use whatever power she supposedly carries." But Lucian didn't move. Instead, he caught her hand in his, and she felt something flow between them, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature, a recognition that seemed to reach into her very bones. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Despite the chaos erupting around them, despite the advancing hunters and the terrified screams of the council, Ilara found herself meeting his gaze. In those silver depths, she saw something that made her breath catch. Not just power or ancient knowledge, but a loneliness so profound it made her chest ache. "I didn't spend 3 centuries in exile to watch the last hope for our kind die in fear," he said. "Your blood doesn't just carry power, Ilara. It carries the future. The question is, will you let that future die because you're afraid of what you might become?" The hunters were inside now, their leader raising a silver blade that gleamed with deadly purpose. Time seemed to slow as Ilara realized that in the next few seconds, everything would change forever, or end before it could begin. Her choice would echo through eternity. But first, she had to find the courage to make it. The silver blade descended like a falling star, its edge singing through the cathedral air with deadly purpose. In that crystalline moment between heartbeats, Ilara felt the last threads binding her to her old life snap like overstressed violin strings. There would be no return to the apothecary shop, No more grinding herbs by candlelight while pretending her pulse didn't mark her as different. No more careful lies or measured breaths or the comfortable weight of brass pestles and familiar remedies. That girl, the one who'd spent 7 years hiding behind nightshade oil and steady voices, was about to die whether she chose courage or cowardice. So she chose fire. "Stop," she commanded, and her voice rang through the cathedral with a resonance that made the very stones tremble. The word carried power she didn't understand, pulled from depths she'd never explored. The descending blade halted mid-strike as if caught in amber. The advancing hunters froze like statues carved from shadow. Even the rain against the broken windows seemed to pause, each droplet suspended in air thick as honey. But this wasn't Lucian's magic. This was hers. Power flowed through her veins like molten gold, burning away every careful deception she'd ever constructed. Her mortal heartbeat thundered against her ribs, but now it felt like war drums rather than weakness. The blood her father had taught her to hide sang with ancient authority, demanding recognition from creatures who'd spent centuries believing themselves her superiors. "Impossible," the lead hunter whispered, though his blade remained frozen inches from her throat. "You're untrained. Powerless." Alara smiled and felt something wild and magnificent unfurling in her chest. "You're right. I am untrained." She stepped closer to the suspended blade, her green eyes blazing with newfound purpose. "That should terrify you more than if I'd spent a lifetime mastering this power, because I have no idea what I'm capable of." The cathedral windows exploded outward in a cascade of rainbow glass, and every candle in the sacred space blazed to life simultaneously. The frozen hunters stumbled backward as supernatural fire danced along the Gothic arches, casting their frightened faces in stark relief. Behind her, she heard Master Aldrich's strangled gasp. "The awakening. Sweet ancestors. She's manifesting without training." Lucian's hand found her shoulder, and his touch steadied the chaotic energy coursing through her. "Breathe," he murmured. "Power, without control, destroys everything it touches." She drew a shuddering breath, and the wild magic settled into something more focused but no less dangerous. The lead hunter's blade crumbled to silver dust between his fingers. "My name," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral, "is Alara Whitmore, daughter of Marcus Whitmore and Elena Nightborn. I am half vampire, half source, and tired of apologizing for existing." She turned to face the cowering council members. "You wanted to judge my blood? Then let me show you exactly what runs in my veins." She pressed her palm against the nearest stone pillar, and crimson light poured from her touch like liquid flame. Ancient symbols blazed to life across the cathedral walls, markings that had been carved by source vampires a millennium ago and hidden under layers of newer construction. The sacred space revealed its true history, and with it, the magnitude of power that had once shaped their world. "The source bloodline isn't extinct," she declared, her words echoing with prophetic weight. "It was sleeping, waiting. And you fools nearly destroyed it because you couldn't see past your own prejudice." Lady Pembroke fell to her knees, her aristocratic composure shattered completely. "Forgive us, we didn't know, we couldn't have—" "You didn't want to know," Alara corrected, and her voice carried the authority of judges and queens. "You preferred your comfortable certainties to complicated truths." The Crimson Order hunters had abandoned their attack entirely, retreating toward the shattered windows with the desperate haste of mice fleeing a burning building. Their leader cast one last look over his shoulder, not hatred now, but something approaching religious awe. "This isn't over," he called, though his voice shook with barely concealed terror. "The Order will not accept—" "The Order," Lucian interrupted, stepping forward with predatory grace, "will learn to accept many things they find uncomfortable. Or they will discover what happens when source power is turned toward vengeance rather than justice." The hunter's face went white as bone, and he vanished through the broken window like smoke on wind. Alara swayed on her feet as the full weight of transformation settled over her. Every cell in her body hummed with new awareness. She could feel the pulse of life throughout Ravencrest, vampire and human, magical and mundane, all connected by threads of energy she'd never noticed before. She was no longer the apothecary's daughter hiding in shadows. She was something unprecedented, powerful, and utterly without precedent. The old world had ended the moment she chose truth. Now she had to help build whatever came next. The ancient symbols carved into the cathedral walls pulsed with dying light as Ilara's awakened power settled into her bones like molten silver, cooling into something solid and permanent. The silence that followed the Crimson Order's retreat felt heavier than the storm clouds gathering over Ravencrest, pregnant with possibilities both magnificent and terrifying. "The real test begins now," Lucien said quietly, his silver eyes scanning the devastation around them. Broken glass crunched beneath his boots as he moved to examine the retreating hunters' abandoned weapons. "Word of your awakening will spread through the vampire courts within hours. Every faction that has slumbered peacefully for 3 centuries will now sharpen their claws." Ilara pressed her fingertips to her temples, trying to process the cacophony of sensations flooding her transformed consciousness. Through the cathedral walls, she could feel the heartbeats of Ravencrest's citizens, mortal and immortal alike, like distant drums echoing through her bloodstream. The overwhelming intimacy of it made her stomach lurch. "I can hear them," she whispered. "Everyone, everything. How do I make it stop?" "You don't," came an unexpected voice from the shadows near the altar. "You learn to listen selectively." Both Ilara and Lucien spun toward the speaker. From behind a fallen marble angel stepped a figure Ilara recognized with a shock of disbelief, Dr. Helena Ashford, the elderly physician who'd treated half of Ravencrest's supernatural community and had been buying remedies from the Whitmore apothecary for nearly a decade. But the woman who emerged from the shadows bore little resemblance to the frail mortal Ilara thought she knew. Dr. Ashford moved with fluid grace, her weathered features sharp with intelligence that seemed to pierce straight through pretense. Most startling of all, her eyes held the telltale silver gleam of vampire heritage. "Helena," Lucien said, and something like relief colored his voice. "I wondered when you'd reveal yourself." "The child's awakening sent ripples through every magical ward in the city," Dr. Ashford replied, approaching with measured steps. Hiding became rather pointless. She studied Ilara with clinical precision. "Though I must say your bloodline manifestation is remarkably unstable for someone who's lived undetected for 23 years. "You knew?" Ilara's voice cracked with betrayal. "All those years you came to the shop, buying tonics for your human patients, and you knew what I was?" Dr. Ashford's expression softened with something approaching maternal concern. "Child, I didn't just know what you were. I've been protecting you. Every remedy I purchased was infused with stabilizing compounds to keep your source heritage dormant until you were strong enough to handle the awakening." The revelation hit Ilara like a physical blow. The iron supplements, the monthly blood-strengthening tonics. "You weren't treating patients at all." "I was treating the most important patient in supernatural history," Dr. Ashford confirmed. "Your mother made me promise to watch over you before she died." Elena knew that an uncontrolled awakening could kill you, or worse, drive you mad with sensory overload. Master Aldrich rose shakily from behind his overturned pew, his ancient face gray with shock. "You're telling us that the Ashford protocols weren't theoretical research. You've been secretly treating a source descendant for decades." "The Ashford protocols," Ilara repeated, pieces of overheard conversation suddenly clicking into place. "Those medical papers you've been publishing about bloodline stability in mixed heritage vampires." Dr. Ashford nodded grimly. "Research based on very real, very dangerous observations. Your mother's pregnancy nearly killed her, Ilara. The conflicting magical signatures in your developing blood created cascade failures that I barely managed to stabilize." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Elena died not from childbirth complications, but from the strain of passing her source abilities to a child with dual heritage. You've been a walking miracle and a walking catastrophe since your first breath." The weight of this knowledge settled over Ilara like a burial shroud. Every year of her hidden life, every careful lie, every moment of feeling different and dangerous, It had all been justified. She truly was an abomination, just as the council had claimed, not because of prejudice or tradition, but because her very existence defied the natural order. Which brings us to the immediate problem, Lucian said, his tone cutting through her spiral of despair. The Crimson Order's retreat was tactical, not permanent. They'll return with reinforcements and artifacts designed specifically to neutralize source magic. Through the broken windows, Elara could see new shapes moving through Ravencrest's fog-shrouded streets. But these weren't hunters. Their movement patterns were too organized, too purposeful. "The city guard," Dr. Ashford observed, following her gaze. "Someone's reported the disturbance. We have perhaps 10 minutes before this location becomes untenable. Then we leave," Elara said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "Where do we go?" Lucian and Dr. Ashford exchanged meaningful looks, and Elara realized that this moment had been anticipated, planned for, perhaps for years. "There's a place," Lucian said finally, "hidden archives beneath the old cemetery. If we're going to teach you to control your abilities before they consume you, we'll need resources that most vampires believe were destroyed centuries ago. And allies," Dr. Ashford added darkly, because the Crimson Order was just the beginning. The journey through Ravencrest's fog-laden streets felt like walking through a fever dream. Elara pulled her cloak tight against the pre-dawn chill, but the cold that seeped into her bones had nothing to do with temperature. Every shadow seemed to writhe with potential threats. Every distant footfall might herald another attack. Her newly awakened senses painted the world in overwhelming detail. She could smell the copper tang of old blood on cobblestones 3 blocks away, hear the whispered conversations behind shuttered windows, feel the pulse of supernatural energies that crisscrossed the city like a vast invisible web. It was magnificent and nauseating in equal measure. "The sensory overload will stabilize," Dr. Ashford murmured, matching Elara's unsteady pace with practiced ease. "Your mind needs time to build proper filters." "How long?" Elara asked, through gritted teeth, as another wave of borrowed emotions. Fear from a sleeping child, hunger from a prowling vampire, loneliness from an insomniac widow, crashed through her consciousness. Weeks, possibly months. The doctor's clinical honesty was both reassuring and terrifying. Source vampires weren't meant to awaken without years of preparation. We're essentially performing experimental medicine in real time. Lucian moved ahead of them like a shadow-given form, his attention split between watching for pursuers and navigating the labyrinthine back alleys that would keep them hidden from the city guard. His centuries of experience showed in every fluid movement, every calculated turn that avoided well-lit intersections. "The cemetery gates are warded," he called softly over his shoulder. "You'll need to maintain physical contact with me to pass through undetected." The thought of touching him again sent an unwelcome flutter through Elara's chest. During her awakening in the cathedral, his hand on her shoulder had been an anchor in the storm of chaotic power. But now, in the relative quiet of their escape, she was acutely aware of how his presence seemed to resonate with something deep in her transformed blood. "Is that normal?" she asked Dr. Ashford quietly. "The way my power responds to him?" The older woman's silver eyes gleamed with knowing concern. Source vampires were created as complementary pairs. Your bloodline recognizes his authority because you're designed to work in harmony. It's not romantic attraction, child. It's magical resonance. That's supposed to be reassuring. Supposed to be honest. Dr. Ashford's voice carried decades of hard-won wisdom. Power of your magnitude requires balance. Lucian isn't just offering protection. His presence keeps your abilities from consuming you entirely. Without that stabilizing influence... She didn't need to finish the sentence. They reached Ravencrest's ancient cemetery as the first pale threads of dawn began to silver the horizon. The wrought iron gates stood open, but Elara could see the shimmer of magical barriers that would turn away casual observers. Lucian extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she accepted it. The contact sent electricity racing up her arm. But this time she was prepared for the sensation. Their combined power flowed together like two streams converging into a river, and the cemetery wards parted like curtains before them. "Remarkable," Dr. Ashford breathed. "I've never seen ward work respond so smoothly to dual casting." They moved between weathered headstones and elaborate mausoleums, following a path that seemed to exist only in Lucian's memory. The fog hung thicker here, muffling sound and creating pockets of absolute darkness that even vampire vision struggled to penetrate. "There," Lucian said, stopping before a modest granite monument bearing the name Corvus. He pressed his palm against the stone, and Alara felt the whisper of ancient magic responding to his touch. The monument shifted with a grinding of hidden mechanisms, revealing stone steps that descended into impenetrable blackness. The air that rose from the depths carried the scent of old parchment and preserved knowledge, a library's perfume aged beyond mortal memory. "The Corvus Archive," Dr. Ashford said reverently. "I thought it was legend." "Legends have a way of being true in our world," Lucian replied. "The original source vampires built this repository to preserve their knowledge for future generations. If Alara is to master her abilities without destroying herself, or everyone around her, she'll need access to training methods that predate modern vampire society by millennia." Alara stared into the darkness below, her enhanced senses detecting the vast scope of what lay hidden beneath Ravencrest's sleeping dead. Books, scrolls, artifacts that hummed with barely contained power. The accumulated wisdom of her ancestors, waiting in the dark for someone worthy to claim it. But as she prepared to descend into that ancient knowledge, a new sound reached her transformed hearing. The rhythmic march of boots on cobblestone, moving with military precision toward the cemetery gates. "They found us," she whispered. Lucian's hand tightened on hers, and his silver eyes blazed with predatory intensity. "Then we'd better hope the old archives contain more than just books. Because if the Crimson Order has brought reinforcements, we're going to need weapons that can match 3 centuries of accumulated hatred." The marching footsteps grew closer, and Alara realized her education in source magic was about to begin under fire. The darkness of the Corvus Archive swallowed them whole as they descended the ancient stone steps, the grinding of hidden mechanisms sealing the entrance above their heads with a finality that made Alara's chest tighten. Behind them, the muffled sounds of the Crimson Order's approach faded into an oppressive silence that seemed to press against her awakened senses like a living thing. "Stay close," Lucian murmured, his voice barely a whisper in the absolute blackness. "The archives are protected by more than just concealment wards." As if summoned by his warning, pale blue flames erupted along the stone walls, casting dancing shadows that revealed a corridor stretching far beyond the reach of normal sight. The flames themselves seemed wrong, too cold, too bright, burning without fuel or heat. They illuminated carved symbols that hurt to look at directly, sigils that seemed to writhe and shift when caught in peripheral vision. Alara's newly awakened power reacted violently to the ancient magic saturating this place. Her blood sang with recognition and terror in equal measure, as if every cell in her body remembered this power from some ancestral dream. The resonance was so strong it made her stumble, and only Lucian's steadying hand kept her upright. "The preservation spells," Dr. Ashford breathed behind them, her clinical composure cracking with awe. "They're still active after all these centuries. The original source vampires built this place to last until the bloodline awakened again." They were expecting someone like me, Alara realized, the weight of that knowledge settling over her like a burial shroud. They knew their bloodline would eventually manifest in a hybrid. They hoped, Lucian corrected grimly. "There's a difference between hope and certainty." The corridor opened into a vast chamber that defied the physical limitations of what should fit beneath Ravencrest's cemetery. Shelves stretched impossibly high into darkness, lined with books, scrolls, and artifacts that pulsed with barely contained power. The air itself seemed thick with accumulated knowledge, pressing against Alara's consciousness with the weight of millennia. But it was the center of the chamber that made her breath catch in her throat. a raised dais where a single tome lay open beneath a sphere of pure white light. The book's pages turned of their own accord, revealing text that shifted and changed as she watched, adapting its contents to whoever observed it. "The Codex Sanguineus," Dr. Ashford whispered. "The complete records of source magic, written by the Bloodline's founder." Elara moved toward the dais, as if drawn by invisible threads, her enhanced senses screaming warnings that she chose to ignore. The book called to something fundamental in her nature, promising answers to questions she'd carried her entire life. But with each step, the pressure in her skull intensified until she could barely think past the pounding in her temples. "Elara, stop!" Lucian's voice cut through her trance-like state. "You're not ready for direct contact with the Codex. Not yet." She turned to face him and saw genuine fear in his ancient eyes. "But it's calling to me. I can feel it. All the knowledge I need is right there." "And it will burn out your mind if you touch it unprepared," he said flatly. The Codex contains 3,000 years of accumulated power. Source vampires spent decades learning to commune with it safely. Above them, a new sound echoed through the archive, the grinding of stone on stone as the entrance mechanisms activated. The Crimson Order had found their way inside. "Impossible," Dr. Ashford hissed. "The wards should have—" "They have a nullifier," Lucian realized, his face going pale. "Someone who can temporarily suppress magical defenses." The implications hit Elara like a physical blow. The Crimson Order hadn't just stumbled upon their hiding place. They'd come prepared with tools specifically designed to breach source vampire protections. Someone had told them exactly what they'd face. "How many vampires know about this place?" she demanded. "Too many," Lucian admitted. The archive's location was never meant to be a complete secret. Only its contents were restricted. Heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor above, accompanied by the scrape of metal on stone. The hunters were armed for war, and this time they wouldn't be caught off guard by an untrained girl's explosive awakening. "We need to leave," Dr. Ashford said urgently. "There are other exits." "No." Elara's voice carried authority that surprised even her. "I'm tired of running. Tired of hiding what I am because it makes others uncomfortable." She turned back to the Codex, its pages still turning with hypnotic rhythm. "You said I'm not ready for direct contact. What about indirect?" Lucian's eyes widened with understanding and horror. "Elara, no. Channeling Codex power without preparation could kill you, or worse. Worse than letting the Crimson Order destroy the only repository of source knowledge in existence." She met his gaze steadily. "I'd rather die as what I truly am than live as what others want me to be." Above them, the first hunter's silhouette appeared at the top of the stone steps, crossbow trained on their position. Elara pressed her palm against the dais, and the ancient archive blazed to life around them. The moment Elara's palm touched the dais, reality fractured. Power beyond comprehension surged through her veins like molten silver, and she understood with crystalline clarity that she had made a catastrophic mistake. The Codex's accumulated knowledge didn't flow into her consciousness. It crashed through her mental barriers like a tsunami, carrying 3 millennia of source vampire memories, emotions, and magical experiences that no mortal mind was designed to contain. She screamed, the sound echoing through the archive with supernatural resonance that shattered preservation crystals and sent ancient books tumbling from their shelves. Through the chaos, she dimly heard Lucian shouting her name, felt Dr. Ashford's hands trying to pull her away from the dais. But the Codex had her now, and it wasn't letting go. Visions flooded her awareness, the original source vampires in their moment of creation, their bodies twisted by experimental magic until they became something neither human nor undead, the centuries of war that followed as they tried to carve out a place in a world that feared their power, the gradual decline as their bloodline grew thin and desperate. She lived through every moment of their history simultaneously, her consciousness scattered across time like light through a prism. But worse than the visions was the power itself. Raw source magic poured through her untrained channels, burning away the careful stabilizations that Dr. Ashford's treatments had built over decades. Her body convulsed as conflicting energies tore at her cellular structure, her dual heritage creating cascade failures that no amount of ancient knowledge could prevent. "The connection is killing her," Dr. Ashford's voice sounded impossibly distant. "Lucian, you have to—" "I know." His reply carried centuries of regret. "But if I sever the link now, the feedback could destroy her mind completely." Above them, crossbow bolts began raining down as the Crimson Order reached the bottom of the stone steps. The hunters had brought more than weapons. Ilara could sense the nullifier's presence like a void in the magical tapestry, a person-shaped absence that made her awakened power recoil in instinctive terror. Their preparation was thorough, professional, designed to counter every advantage a source vampire might possess. Through her fragmented awareness, she watched Lucian and Dr. Ashford position themselves between her convulsing form and the approaching hunters. Lucian moved with the fluid grace of centuries, but she could see the strain in his movements. Maintaining the power resonance that had kept her stable was draining him, and now he was trying to fight while handicapped by their magical connection. "Dr. Helena Ashford," called a cold voice from the advancing hunters. "By order of the Crimson Covenant, you are commanded to surrender the abomination for purification." "Go to hell, Morrison," Dr. Ashford replied with remarkable composure for someone facing down armed fanatics. "The child is under my medical protection." "The child is a walking catastrophe," Morrison responded. "Look around you. She's already destroying priceless magical artifacts simply by existing. How many more will die when her power grows beyond all control?" As if to emphasize his point, another wave of uncontrolled energy burst from Ilara's contact with the Codex. Ancient wardstones cracked, their protective spells unraveling in cascade failures that left gaps in the archive's defenses. She was becoming a weapon against the very knowledge she'd tried to save. The battle erupted with brutal efficiency. Crossbow bolts flew toward Lucian, who deflected them with supernatural speed while silver-tipped spears thrust toward Dr. Ashford's position. But the Crimson Order's true advantage wasn't their weapons, it was their nullifier, whose presence turned the Archive's protective magic against its defenders. Ilara felt the moment when Lucian's strength finally gave out. The stabilizing resonance between them flickered and failed, leaving her completely at the mercy of the Codex's overwhelming power. But instead of the merciful unconsciousness she expected, something far worse began to happen. Her awakened source abilities started to burn out. She could feel her enhanced senses failing one by one, her newfound connection to the supernatural world dissolving like sugar in rain. The part of her that had finally felt complete, finally felt like she belonged somewhere in the vast cosmos, was being consumed by power too great for her hybrid nature to contain. "No," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the sounds of battle. "Please, not this." But the Codex showed no mercy. Having awakened to its full potential too quickly, her source heritage was collapsing under the strain. Soon, she would be nothing but human again. Weak, mortal, ordinary. Everything that made her special would be gone, burned away by her own desperate attempt to claim power she wasn't ready to wield. Through her failing enhanced vision, she saw Lucian fall as multiple crossbow bolts found their mark. Dr. Ashford cried out as a silver blade opened a gash across her shoulder, sending her staggering backward toward the dais. The Crimson Order closed in for the kill, and Ilara realized with crushing finality that her attempt to save the archive had doomed everyone she cared about. The ancient repository of source knowledge would be destroyed, Lucian and Dr. Ashford would die, and she would survive only as a powerless human to live with the consequences of her catastrophic failure. The darkness took her as Morrison raised his blade for the finishing blow.